Good afternoon. My name is Luis Suarez. I'm the Chief Learning and Innovation Officer at ACE, and I am pleased to welcome you to this webinar on rethinking accountability in shared equity leadership presented by ACE in partnership with the University of Southern California Pullias Center. ACE and USC are committed to advancing equity-minded leadership and student success in higher education and have been collaborating on the Shared Equity Leadership Project since 2019. Today, we will be sharing findings from our third report in the series, which is focused on ways that campuses implementing SEL are grappling with accountability in environments where DEI is broadly distributed and shared. We at ACE value our longstanding partnership with Adrianna Kezar and the Pullias Center and are particularly enthusiastic about the Shared Equity Leadership Project and providing leaders with practical, evidence-based ways to build cross-institutional strategies to increase equity on their campuses. In this webinar, we are thrilled to gather and learn from the industry's leading voices on equity and accountability, and specifically unpacking how traditional notions of accountability are expanded when sharing leadership for equity. Got that out okay. We will begin with a short presentation reviewing the Rethinking Accountability Report before we transition to a 30-minute panel discussion and then audience Q&A. I want to invite our audience to submit their questions through the chat function on Zoom throughout the presentation. We will monitor the chat and try to get to as many questions as possible. The webinar will be recorded and made available on ACE's Shared Equity Leadership webpage, acenet.edu/ESL. I'm joined today by three distinguished panelists. Sheri-Ann Butterfield, the Executive Vice Chancellor and Associate Professor of Sociology at Rutgers University, Newark. Cynthia Hammond Jackson, President of Council for Higher Education Accreditation. And Raquel Rall, Associate Professor, School of Education, University of California, Riverside. Additionally, I'm always delighted to welcome Adrianna Kezar, Wilbur Kiefer, Endowed Professor of Higher Education, Dean's Professor of Leadership, and Director of the Pullias Center for Higher Education at the University of Southern California, who will moderate the conversation. Before I hand it off to Adrianna, I want to share ways each of you can get involved with the work. ACE hosts quarterly shared equity leadership circles, online facilitated social learning spaces, where you work with peers, sharing and growing expertise around approaches to leading for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Learning about and leveraging key concepts and tools, from the SEL model to mitigate DEI challenges. Additionally, we are hosting a virtual summit on shared equity leadership in April and welcome your participation. Also, I would like to thank the Research and Content Strategy team for their leadership and great work in making these opportunities possible at ACE. Finally, I would like to thank Darcilla Vigil, Fatma Ngoma, Liz Howard, and our USC partners for planning and making this webinar happen. Welcome to everyone, and with that, I'm going to hand it off to you, Adrianna.
Thank you so much, Louis. It is always a pleasure to be in company with you, and so excited for everyone who's here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just a few slides to get us all familiar with some of the findings from the report, and to hopefully, get you excited enough to read the full report, and just give us a little background. As Louis said, we're very excited to share this new line of work around shared equity leadership, and some of you may be familiar with our original report. This is a leadership approach which really creates culture change on campus so that the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is shared across faculty, staff, administrators, and it connects what we've seen in a lot of work before, the individual transformation and organizational transformation that's really necessary for culture change. So we've been really about this, what we see as a pivotal piece in making progress on this issue that for so long higher education has not made the kind of progress, and that's hence this theme here of accountability. So just by way of background, this project, as Louis mentioned, is a partnership between AC and USC that really started in conversations back in 2017, but was finally off the ground with a research study in 2019. So we're 3 years into the research. It's had 2 phases now. We identified 8 campuses that had made significant progress on their equity agendas. And we had these 2 driving questions about how do higher education leaders conceptualize and practice leadership in the face of challenging and complex diversity and equity imperatives that they're trying to move forward, and how is this leadership shared broadly so that DEI work is not siloed or relegated to certain office or set of leaders, which has been very typical on college campuses. As a result of this long-term study, we have 3 reports that are on the slide here that have come out, and a toolkit about how to work with on your own campus, a way to make shared equity leadership come to life. And we have 3 new reports that we're working on this fall, one of which is the focus of this session. So in this session, we're going to focus, as I said, on accountability. And this is really important because state systems and institutions are creating new metrics to monitor student success, diversity, equity, and inclusion due to the lack of progress after years of dedicated efforts to improve student success and campus climate on campuses. So policymakers and accreditors have rightly become concerned over the years, and they're demanding results. And so, for example, we've seen recent changes in accreditation where institutions are going to be held accountable for their diversity, equity, and inclusion in their regular self-evaluation and reaccreditation processes. We also have increasingly stakeholders on campus who are really concerned about seeing progress. We have seen people become increasingly tired of the lack of progress, hence some of the student protests also that we're seeing. So there's really a shared vision from external and internal actors that we need to be more accountable for equity. So before I dive into the report, just a little background on leadership and equity as we think about them in this work. So for us, equity, probably many of you think about it as the state or quality of being just, impartial, or fair. But we really want to underscore that we think about equity from a systemic perspective, and that it has to do with our institutions, our organizations, our society being consciously designed so it sustains equity. Equity does not happen without conscious, intentional effort, and the onus for ameliorating inequities is on the system, or for us, campuses, not individuals who've experienced this inequity. And secondly, when we think of leadership, we're not thinking of those just in positions of power. We have a very non-positional, non-authority based and collective understanding of leadership. So when we're speaking about leaders, we're speaking about not just, say, administrators, but also faculty, staff, and even student leaders on our campuses. So the model that we identified, I just wanted to give everybody a little background. The first phase of the study is essentially an entirely new way to approach campus leadership around DEI, and it foregrounds the importance of a personal journey towards critical consciousness among leaders at all levels. As I'm saying, that's for faculty, staff, and administrative leaders. It also highlights a new set of values that leaders across campus adopt. And one of the things that we found really interesting in this model is it's about a different way of being, not just a different set of things that we do, but it's about different ways that leaders show up in terms of being vulnerable and expressing love and care and being very transparent. So it's a very different mode of leadership. And lastly, it highlights some key practices, some of which may look familiar to you, such as, really careful communications or developing relationships, but some others that may not be familiar, such as disrupting or questioning. So this was the leadership model that came out of our first phase of work. And in this second phase of work, we wanted to dig deeper into the model and some of the areas that were raised that leaders said, this is really critical to re-examine if you want to make shared equity leadership come to life on your campus. And accountability was one of those issues that we dug into deeply and that leaders spoke about as really important. And I want to briefly note a difference between responsibility and accountability. They're both key dimensions of an accountability system, but sometimes even the people we spoke with in the study really struggled to separate the two. And this can result in a lack of outcomes focus. So in a system, you need to pay attention to really thinking broadly about distributing responsibility, but also accountability for results. So in a nutshell, what did we find in our study was really an expansion of ideas around accountability that's captured on the slide. So who is accountable changes, to whom people on campus are accountable changes, for what they are accountable changes, and how they are held accountable. The accountability system, if you will, is markedly changed. So this was the facets that we found. So let's dig into each area briefly. So first, who is accountable? So in a shared equity leadership system, instead of us, a chief diversity officer or president or some combination being more solely accountable, now accountability is pushed out to various leaders across campus, holding different colleges, divisions, and units accountable for their results and being evaluated and rewarded based on the results of their progress. Also, there was more individual ownership, holding each individual leader accountable for the work of equity. So it's embedded into staff and faculty roles, administrative roles, the way they talk about the roles, and annual review processes as well. So the second area is to whom campuses are accountable, and this is also altered. So in traditional accountability within hierarchical and authority-based systems, leadership is sort of typically centered on external groups, for accountability. So this would be policymakers, boards. That's who you're accountable to for the results of your DEI. Within shared equity leadership, these external groups are still a major focus of accountability. What's different is making equity a priority for some of these groups, for example, board members, where this really hasn't been a major focus. So these campuses work with their boards to make equity a priority. Beyond this expansion in traditional accountability sources, accountability to the broader regional or local community, as well as the campus community, becomes a major focus. So the local community, has been deep, is often connected to a part of this work. So reporting out to that community, local community, the results of DEI becomes a significant part of the efforts, as well as telling the campus community where we are on a regular basis and being accountable to your campus constituents. The measures of accountability expand, and while institution level accountability metrics, that are familiar in our systems today, remain a focus. Since culture change is now a key goal in shared equity leadership, campuses moved away from only thinking about outcomes to understanding the importance of the environment that produces those outcomes, specifically the experience of students, being held accountable for the environment in which students are educated. So campuses are looking at measures of climate, assessing staff and faculty behaviors that shape that environment, and evaluating students' experience and success with processes like advising. So digging much more deeply into, processes, behaviors, and climate. Leaders described behavioral expectations that they had of colleagues, which were reinforced in hiring processes and orientation, and included then in accountability, performance evaluations each year. So these expectations and review processes establish a set of norms that guide a type of culture and environment the campuses are trying to create. So this is really quite different. And then campuses are holding themselves accountable for equity-related results in a variety of operational processes. So how they're doing on diverse hiring, how they're doing on professional development related to DEI. So they're really expanding the kinds of processes they look at and hold themselves accountable. They also were really pressing for longer timeframes for accountability because culture change requires a much longer trajectory. So even though they have interim goals, they needed to think about a longer term accountability system. And then what was really fascinating, I think, was just on these campuses, they really established much more sophisticated accountability systems by creating these sort of iterative and multi-level plans and implementation. This is very different from the way campuses have operated, because here the means for obtaining accountability are as just important as the end. So the accountability system builds in, as I was talking about, that more responsibility for the work, because there's all these different layers and levels that are built into it. And tying these plans to performance systems, which is incredibly important if we want to see results, and budgeting, trying to look at how do we have an impact on the amount that campuses are thinking about that goes to units based on their performance on metrics. We also documented a whole lot of tensions and challenges, as you can imagine, as I've just described some of the findings. And we don't have time to address these today because I want to get to the panel, but I'll provide one example. Campuses were collecting data about students' experiences in the climate, which could point to ways that units or individuals are not performing, right? And campuses wrestled with, how do you want to provide feedback, you want to make sure that there's a developmental experience for people, if a faculty gets for evaluations. But you need to ensure at some point that the feedback have teeth. So if you have 4 years of 4 evaluations, when do you start to hold people accountable? So when this should happen was highly debated and not always shared in terms of the timing and approach. So I just wanted to end by noting that the report has a toolkit to help campuses in revising their accountability systems over time, so it can reflect this new SEL approach to work. And as I said, I hoped that this overview and our panel coming up have intrigued you to read the full report. So I now want to turn to our panel. You've already been introduced to us. I'm going to get us out of the shared screen so that we can talk as a group here. And thank them all so much again for being here today. And I'm going to start off with a question for all of our panelists, which is, why is accountability so important for the advancement of diversity, equity, inclusion in each of your minds? And I'll start with Cynthia.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. As you were going through your presentation talking about accountability, I was trying to reflect from my days as a college president that accountability is the cornerstone for every aspect of higher ed. There are no opportunities or a rationale for just saying something without some level of productivity or some level of measuring the outcomes. So with accountability, it's important in every aspect. It speaks to intentionality, commitment, and there's absolutely no way to measure the success of DEI or any of the outcomes unless there is some intentionality toward being accountable. When you have DEI as a central mission of the institution, you can really begin to look at a shift in the culture of that institution. And that won't happen as a one-time purpose, but it is a long and continuous commitment to trying to improve, trying to be better. So accountability at every level in higher education is essential.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And Raquel, I'm just going to turn to you to see if you have further thoughts on why accountability is so important in this space.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Cynthia said. I would just add that I think specifically for DEI work, it's important because too often we think of it as this sort of philosophical idea that it's up in the air and we can't touch it, we don't know what it is and all of these different things. And so without accountability, right, it doesn't make it tangible for folks. And I think that's what's made it hard to sort of advance this idea of what it means to, center, as Cynthia was saying, is this is part of your mission, DEI, right? And that sort of thing. And so, it's important to understand that it's not just DEI for the sake of DEI and just for the good of the order. DEI is good for business, right? It's good for morale. It's good for your reputation. It's good for all of these different things. And I think until we connect those two, right, with the accountability, then it's going to be hard for us to make that progress. And so, when you were asking this question and thinking about when we learn how to do CPR and all these different things, it's like someone's doing CPR, someone else tells someone go call 911 and come back, right? That accountability of coming back to make sure that it was done, right? To know that you can move forward. I think those things are important. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I love that idea. Like, we need to make this more concrete, but for many people it hasn't. And Sheri-Ann, I'd love you to add on your thoughts on the same question.
I think Cynthia and Raquel did an amazing job. Good morning and good afternoon. I think the only thing I would add, and it's not really an ad, it's just a different way of phrasing, is that the authenticity of it, right? To Raquel's point about DEI for DEI's sake, I feel like a lot of institutions and organizations are doing that. Oh, we have a plan with no there. That's always my thing. What's your there for DEI? And there is a there. It's not just a theory. There's an action to it. And as we're trying to build trust and transparency with both in our organizations and outside of our organizations, that's essential, right? And so, as to the point of it being a business plan, how do we get more students if we're actually not true to our own mission, right? And how do we get the buy-in of our faculty and staff if we're not being authentic about it? And authenticity comes from accountability. Are you really doing what you're saying that you're going to do? And that's critical. And Cynthia's right that this has always been the focus of higher ed, but I think DEI is a little different because I think people think the joy is just to be able to say we have a plan. I'm not about the plan. I'm about what you do with the plan, right?
Thank you for saying I that idea of how much and I worry about efforts becoming performative, right? And doing things, but if we don't say that people have to make, campuses have to make progress over time, it has become largely performative around the existence of things like plans, and we need to see progress. Well, thank you so much for that. And I'd like to go on to our second question. And Raquel, I'll start with you this time. And how do you make a distinction between responsibility and accountability? And why do you think that distinction matters? And I tried to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah,
already.
no, I think you did a great job. And when you're giving sort of the overview of it, and I don't know how many people actually think about that because it is so entangled. And then I will say, well, I think there is a distinction. I think you need to have both, right? And just because we disaggregate them doesn't mean that you can have one without the other. I think they're really important. But I think, sort of responsibility is more focused on those tasks and those projects that you were talking about is who's supposed to be doing what are we all supposed to be doing? It's like Cynthia has this, Raquel has this, Adrianna has this, Sheri-Ann has this, right? These are the things that we're supposed to do. But then accountability is the back end, and who's making sure that we do that, right? Who's responsible for those results? Like to who, for what are we responsible, and all these different things. And so I think they go hand in hand, but I think the responsibility comes first, right? And then the accountability is the piece to make sure that folks were doing those things that they were responsible for.
For that, one of the things that's kind of fascinated me is I feel like I had what I would see on, in the past, kind of in some of my earlier studies, is I would see more people being responsible, but then nobody being accountable, or somebody being, accountable, but no one else is being responsible. And it was like these two had somehow in our history of our campuses become very decoupled. And it's a very odd kind of thing. And I feel like what I'm watching on these campuses is they finally coupled these again. They coupled responsibility and accountability in a way that I had just seen it float away. Well, Sheri-Ann or Cynthia, anything else to add on this question of the distinction between responsibility and accountability?
Yeah, I agree with what Raquel, and I like to think of responsibility very precisely as it's about the appointment of a job, the appointment of duty. You know, you do this is your job. The accountability is the production of evidence that that job has been done. And sometimes people have the responsibility, but they do not provide the evidence that shows completion or progress. And so one goes with the other, but it's not really complete if both are not working in tandem. So responsibility is whose job is it? Accountability is show me the evidence that the job has been done or the work is in progress. It also means that, responsibility of one person doing a job is never a good thing. It's never a good thing. I used to have this pet peeve, and I'm just going to digress just a little bit. When someone picks up the phone and says, "May I have information about this?" and the person says, "Oh, that person is on vacation, and you have to wait until they get back." You know, when you have one person without any cross collaboration, without any cross training, then it becomes an isolated job. And when you're working with diversity, equity, and inclusion, integration, that's everybody's business because it's a cultural paradigm shift which leads to student success when done properly.
Thank you for that. I'm going to shift into our third question, and I'll start with you, Sheri-Ann, about what are your thoughts on this expansion of accountability that was in the Shared Equity Leadership Report? And how do you think this expansion helps to advance accountability efforts on campuses?
I really appreciated it in the report. And, we've been talking about shared equity I've been talking with you all for a while. And, I think to Cynthia's point, one of the things when you talk about accountability, it cuts down, if you do it right, it cuts down on the siloing that happens in higher education and across campuses, right? And so if sometimes accountability and responsibility are in the same person, and sometimes it's not. And so that fosters a different kind of conversation. And it requires, again, to Cynthia's point, where one person should not be responsible for all these things. If they can't take a vacation. And if DEI is all of our jobs, then we should all be in conversation with each other. It's not going to be easy conversation. I don't want to sort of Pollyannish this at all, but really about how do we work together towards this goal for both success for our students, success for our faculty, success for our staff, and success for our communities that we all sit in as well. And so I think the focus and the expansion on accountability, I completely appreciated it. And it's like, oh, thank goodness someone's actually talking about it. Because I think that's a part of the conversation that often gets left out. And so I'll stop there and let my other colleagues talk, but I think it's critical to this conversation.
Raquel, what are your thoughts? Thank you so much, Sheri-Ann.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that. I do think that, equity, it's everyone's job, right? And I think without that expansion, and why I like that expansion, it's too easy to say, oh, nope, Adrianna's got that. I don't have to worry about that. All that equity stuff, she's going to do everything. But when you understand that equity is a part of every facet of the university, right? And thinking about the community, thinking about the campus, students, everything, then you understand that it's all of our jobs, right? It's really important. How we enact that may look differently because we have different roles and responsibilities, but it's necessarily in your purview to focus on DEI, right? Like as a faculty member, that may look different for me, right? Than an administrator, than an advisor, right? That sort of thing. But everyone needs to have that equity mindedness about them to understand that this is important, right? Like thinking about both the means and the ends as you were talking about. So I really like what Sheri-Ann talked about is that, this expansion sort of limits that siloing, which is really important. And if we have that as our shared thread, it's easier for us to work together, right? Oftentimes we think about shared responsibility, shared equity leadership, right? Shared governance, but we don't really understand sometimes, I think, what we're sharing and how that works, right? If we don't understand what the other parts are doing and have that understanding understanding of what is your job and how can I support you in what I'm doing, right? When everyone does their part well, that's when we are able to expand it, right? And so I think that that's really important. That expanded idea is great. It gives folks permission to get on board, right? Otherwise, folks will say like, oh, that's their expertise, they need to do that. No. Everyone needs to be a part of this if we really want to move the needle, right? It's everyone's job. And so I really resonated with this idea of this expanded version of leadership. So thank you for that.
So, and thanks for calling. You brought up the topic of our one of our next report coming out, which is how do different roles on campus lean into shared equity leadership? How does it look differently when I'm the business officer, I'm doing fundraising, or I'm in facilities? Like what does, we typically don't think about all these different kinds of roles and the ways DEI plays out. So thank you so much for bringing that up, because that will be the next report to say, like, what does this look like, when we're all doing this work and taking responsibility, so that it's, if people are able to vision that more. And then I'll just end, Cynthia, with you. Any thoughts on this expansion of accountability in the shared equity leadership report that you wanted to talk about?
I think Sheri-Ann and Raquel really spoke to the same thoughts that I had. I do like what Raquel says, that it gives people permission to lean in. And so sometimes in higher ed, and I've been in all kinds of higher education institutions, we do silo. We want to ask questions, but we don't want to get into other people's business. And so when it becomes a fully integrated process within the campus, it gives you permission to ask questions without feeling like you are interrupting or interloping or intruding. And I think that that's a very, very powerful, open kind of transparency for an institution. If institutions are supposed to be the bedrock of academic vitality, then asking questions and engaging is part of that academic vitality. And what better subject than diversity, equity, and inclusion, which touches everyone differently, but it certainly does impact everyone on a college campus.
Great point. I really appreciate that. And how all of you touched on this kind of breaking down of silos, which is, we've just found across every kind of study so important to student success and diversity, equity, inclusion work. So Cynthia, I'm gonna turn to you specifically for this question about, from an accreditation perspective, how can the proposed changes in the report related to accountability support some of these national efforts to strengthen DEI on campus?
Well, let me begin by thanking the contributors to the development of the Shared Equity Leadership Report. It was comprehensive. It provided significant insights for institutions that are beginning their DEI processes. And so it's an excellent guide. It also serves institutions by saying that there is an intentional reminder that there is an inextricable link between DEI and a culture of success for students, families, staff, administration, and the community that surrounds an institution. Sometimes we think the institution is just what's on the campus, but that institution has tentacles in the community at large. And sometimes the community looks to the institution to be the beacon to begin those kinds of dialogues. I like to think of DEI integration as being analogous to a team sport. You have various players with specific responsibilities, but all working toward a common goal. And the goal is to win. In this case, winning is seeing students become successful because of a strategic DEI plan that reflects an appreciation and value for those students. And so we can all say, institutions said, oh, come, we want larger enrollments. We want you to come here. But are we really showing an appreciation and a value of what those students bring to the campus? The discussion of accountability for a cultural campus change must include every level of a campus operation, just like a team sport. And going beyond the discussion is the necessity to identify achievable outcomes that can be measured, assessed, changed if needed, re-implemented, and re-evaluated. There is certainly effectiveness when a president says, I want to have this expanded DEI. That's big. Sometimes it can come from the ground up organically, but when you have the leader of the institution putting a strategic focus on that, that sends a very clear message. And I will also say that it's important that boards of governance support presidents who take that initiative and that brave step to say, this is just as important as, or more important than fundraising. Believe it or not, it's more important than fundraising. When it comes to, the sport analogy, everybody wants to win. But if you don't win every time, you don't stop playing. You just keep trying. And that's the continuous model improvement that goes along with accreditation. Accreditation is about accountability. It's about transparency. It's about continuous improvement. All of those things are embedded in being able to say to a community and to students, we as an institution are keeping our promise. So accreditation is about a peer review process. So is DEI. It starts with how we think about ourselves collectively in this body. Same way with accreditation. So there are certainly some commonalities between DEI integration, student success, student achievement, and a cultural climate that really very, very emphatically say, we are going to continue to do this until we get it right. And every time, let me just close out by saying this, that the Council for Higher Education, CHEA, the organization I represent, is the only non-governmental recognition agency that has incorporated DEI in its standards. The Department of Education has this recognition, but for us, it's such a critical matter for how students succeed. When students come to an institution, they don't come insular from who they are. They bring every experience they have. And for institutions not to recognize and value that is to negate student success. So we want to intentionally push accreditors to work with institutions in order to make sure that there is a full appreciation for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you. That is such a powerful and great point. And I'm going to turn now to Raquel, because you think a lot about the role of boards and diversity, equity, inclusion. So what struck you as helpful to underscore in the report and other considerations you might like to offer about boards and the ways they can support DEI work?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, obviously, the first thing that struck me by the report is that there was a section just for boards, right? Like too often in this work, we don't talk about boards. It's the president's role. It's the CDO's role. It's the faculty's role. It's everyone else's job, but the board, right? And so that was, music to my governance board nerd-like ears, right? Like that's really important because they need to know that this means them. Right. Oftentimes, a problem that we have with boards is that they're so busy watching everyone else and watching what they're doing. They don't understand they have a role to play. Right. Like they can be, a catalyst to whatever's happening. They can also be a barrier to what's happening because they play such a pivotal role. So I think that to me struck, something that struck a chord that was very important. I think the number one takeaway for boards is going to be that toolkit. Right. By and large, I think the majority of boards understand that DEI matters, but they don't know how to get in the game. Right, Cynthia, to go into your analogy, they don't know how to get involved. It's sort of like, put me in, coach. I don't know. Right. We don't know how to get in there. They don't know what to do. Right. It's not very clear as to where their lane is. They have been slapped on the wrist so much in the past for don't get into the weeds, don't do this, that they are not sure as to how to enact DEI from this board lens, right? So I think that that's really important. And so sort of to underscore that, and I think it's important to understand, in their specific roles, thinking about their fiduciary duties or their role in hiring and monitoring a president, how do we help them to understand that DEI can be part of that, right? How do you think about DEI when you're selecting a president? What are those factors that are important? How do we add that to that examination, right? How do we think about that when we're thinking about mission, right? Boards are supposed to help us uphold our mission to the community, to everyone. Like, are we thinking about DEI when we're doing that tuition hike, right? That's a board decision. How does this impact DEI? So I think as we continue to help them think about what this really means for them, understanding that boards are not higher ed experts in any way, shape, or form, right? Very few have that connection other than going to higher ed. So they need that support, right? So I really appreciated that part in the report as well, talking about, speaking to that, like, this is not their expertise. A lot of folks don't know about equity and that sort of thing. And it's okay to use experts, to bring folks in, right, who know how to do that part of the game. And then it aligns with the other part of the report, talking about the philanthropic part. We need funds for that, right? We've talked about this, Adrianna, many times. Like, folks need to support work on governance. I know it's hard because it's sort of abstract, right? But hopefully with reports like this, it's not as abstract, but it's so integral to what needs to happen, right? There is nothing that's technically not in the board purview, right? They delegate a lot of those roles and responsibilities, but ultimately sort of the buck stops there, right? Like, the board has that ultimate decision, and they often stay a lot longer than, you think about, I'm in the UC system, regents who have a 12-year term, that's a long time to be somewhere, right? And then you get reappointed, and that's 24 years. So you're making direct, some are there, right? That have been, right? They're making direct impact on picking system heads, on picking institution heads, on, approving tenure and promotion processes, all these different things that we don't think initially and intuitively have impacts on DEI, but it does, right? It has implications. And too often we think about, from the boards and the boards I've worked with, they think of it as a phenotypic thing, right? They don't think of it as this systemic idea, Adrianna, like you're saying, right? They're like, okay, we have enough Black and brown folks. There's some women. We're great. And they don't understand the core of it, right? The systemic parts of it, and the history of it, and how we got here, and why this matters, and why, if our student body looks different, our board should look different, why our faculty should look different. All of these different things should happen, and why we need to look at the processes and the practices that we have in place that are also perpetuating some of these things, right? I think that that's an important board learning idea. So I think that that's something I would say we just need to continue the work. But I was so pleased to have something on boards in there. And I think that, again, of all the groups, they need that permission to get involved more than anyone else, because they don't have that direct connection to campuses. They're meeting episodically. They don't have that background. And so it's really important to engage them in this work. And not only, Cynthia talked about supporting the president, but also helping to choose the right president that's going to focus on DEI. Like, it's sort of like a chicken and egg sort of thing. If you're in there and you have someone already, but think about when you're getting a new person, this is your opportunity to infuse DEI and make sure you're getting someone who is centered on that, right? So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And just this idea, you're right, that right now when boards get involved, it's sort of just like looking at maybe graduation rates. So like the whole span, I think what was so exciting was to see that boards could think about, other kinds of things that are really important to supporting DEI beyond just what are disaggregated graduation rates, which has been pretty much the focus. Sheri-Ann, I would love if you can tell us the story of how your campus moved from kind of maybe a narrower view to a more expanded and more complex system of accountability, just hearing it from the ground.
Thank you for the question, and it was rather large in the process. And I'm just going to give a small example. So Rutgers Newark has been one of the most diverse national institutions for over 20 years, and I say that because it wasn't intentional. Where we sit geographically, between the migration and immigration streams into this region, that's sort of how our student body came, and that's important, because without the intentionality, you have a very different experience, right? And so. And we're sitting in the center of Newark. And so when we had a strategic plan, when we had a new chancellor, this is where the importance of leadership comes on. So Nancy Cantor comes, we have a strategic planning process. And out of that, with faculty, staff, and students, it says, people come up and say, we're sitting in Newark. Are we really recruiting people from Newark? Or are we just assuming they'll come here because we sit here? Are we really taking care of transfer students who have a range of equity issues, right? So it's not only just about race, and how do we have conversations about socioeconomic status, religion, gender, sexual identity? So there's all of that. And we had to confront the fact that we hadn't been actually taking care of our students the way that we should be. We hadn't been recruiting them the way we should. We hadn't been retaining them. So we started on a small scale and created what we call an honors living learning community. We had a traditional honors college, but this new initiative was really speaking to both what Cynthia and Raquel said, and you've said, Adrianna, in terms of honoring the experiences that the students bring to them. So you're not looking at SAT scores, you're not looking at ACT scores. These are students who are successful in their high schools or in their community colleges and who deserve a shot just because they can't, this exam is an issue. And so we have a holistic admissions process. But to even have that conversation, we had to confront what we were using to measure student success. And the offices that were part of it. And so one of the things that I loved about it, which is why it took a few years to actually took 1 to 2 years to build, but what does it mean to put, and I'm just listing them off as I remember them, what does it mean to put faculty, academic advisors, the admissions office, budget and finance team, the facilities, student affairs, governmental external relations, and the advancement team all in the same room to talk about how do we build this thing? How do we build something that students apply to, get retained, and live in? So when you think about the structure, facilities, if this is what the kind of experience you want the students to have, this is what the building needs to look like. So that level of granularity was so important. And so one of you said, I think it might have been, Raquel will talk about the roles, right? People don't understand what others do at a university because we're so siloed. So when the faculty said, well, if we change this curriculum, this should be great. And the academic affairs people and the academic advisors said, well, how am I supposed to advise when there are, 6 different schools? Let's slow this down. Then the staff had to learn about faculty governance. That conversation was hilarious to me as a faculty member, but normal for me as a faculty member, but it was not normal for a lot of my colleagues. And so those kinds of things, were both the great things, but also really challenging, because part of when you spread out responsibility and accountability, you have to be trusting, you have to put, and this is also in the report, and there's a level of, you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, and there's a loss of control, right? So for some people, this is my admissions office, or this is my budget office, and you can't tell me how to spend my money, or, those things happen, or spend our money, but, it's just the ways in which it gets a little tricky. And then if you put the systems on top of how that work gets done, the research office, if you get a grant to fund this, who's getting credit and and what happens when you ask the community to also weigh in on how we serve them or don't serve them, right? And so it's hard to hear what you're not doing right well. It's hard to hear about people not understanding how hard you work, because that's the other part, right? These are folks who have been working really, really hard. But if you talk about DEI as a universal idea, how does that, but have a conversation about how that may change their job or their positionality without feeling it being threatening to them, that's a delicate balance as well. And so it was a lot of conversation, and that's part of it. The time investment that goes into this work, that there's not going to be a magic bullet in a year, all of a sudden our graduation rates are going to go up, our retention, but really putting in the work. And I think this also speaks to people's commitment to the work. They see that you're dedicated because you're putting in the time and you're putting in the work. And that's been really great. One of the things that makes me laugh now is that we just had a meeting this morning, and we were talking about a new initiative, and the staff member said, Sheri, remember what the mission is. We are DEI focused, we are equity focused. And I'm like, oh, I know, thanks for the reminder, but it was so great. And this person got hired in COVID. So that says something about how it's made its way through the institution, because I think it's important for it to be top down, but it also needs to be bottom up. There are folks who don't like when it only comes from the president. They're like, how are you going to tell me how to do this? So it's really important. I think at least for us, it's been important that it's both of those things. It's a both and the key is always faculty. Always, it's clear what faculty role is in higher ed, but I think oftentimes we forget the professional staff, and putting those communities together in real conversation is so important, because they're the ones who also help we all get this work done together. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And Sheri-Ann, that your last comments really tie into, I'm turning into some of the questions we've gotten from those attending the session. And one of them is about, how do you continue this work, particularly at a predominantly white institution. They're saying as a student, professional, it's exhausting navigating power dynamics, sort of this idea. And you're talking about, I think one of the things we found across these campuses is, that they had garnered support at the senior level, the mid-level, and sort of the grassroots bottom-up level to get that shared. And, at some level, inevitability of power dynamics, if you're not able to start getting champions across those different levels. And I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that question, but for those, there's probably a lot of people here who they're in some position in the institution, but they don't have others, they may not have other sort of levels. Maybe there's a couple other faculty or a couple other staff, but any thoughts about how to help, I guess, garner more of that critical mass? I think it's part of that question. And so you have to navigate less of those. You can't get around those power dynamics unless you get more of a critical mass.
Yeah. Adrianna, I want to think that a strategic plan on a campus really means something. Sometimes we think the strategic plan is a document that's beautifully written and then it's put aside and no one pays attention to it. But what's important about the strategic plan is that it's supposed to be inclusive of a variety of people, or most people that represent parts of the institution. That's students, that's faculty, that's administrators, that's staff, that's community members. When DEI becomes part of a strategic plan, that means that the plan is supposed to be implemented. And along with that implementation is a budget. For every goal of a strategic plan, that's how the finance and administration and the budgetary committee decide if this is the university's plan, if this is our trajectory, then we have to put finances with the goals that are to be implemented. Then it does not become just whether or not certain people want to see it done. It is the focus of my experience with strategic plans was that don't come to me with an idea that's not in the strategic plan unless it's going to impact the strategic plan in a meaningful way. So once institutions, I think, began to have critical discussions about who are we? What are we supposed to be about? And how do we make that happen? And diversity, equity, and inclusion should be in the campus real-time strategic plan with benchmarks for observation, benchmarks for assessment, and an opportunity to regroup, re-energize, and keep it going. That strategic plan is supposed to be for 5 years, at least a minimum of 5 years, with opportunity to measure, are we moving in the right direction? And I would advocate that after 5 years, if DEI is in your plan, you put it in again for another 5 years or another 10 years, because DEI to some degree should not be thought of in terms of, okay, we have finally reached our DEI mountain. No, when you think you have reached that mountain, you start climbing a little bit higher, because DEI is impacted by the politics, the economy, about globalization, about the culture of communities, about people. So if that's a changing set of dynamics, shouldn't DEI be able to change along with those dynamics? So it doesn't matter whether or not I don't want to be glib about saying it doesn't matter whether or not you're a PWI or HBCU, because an HBCU or minority serving institution requires the same level of intentionality. Yeah.
Cynthia, that's so great that you said that, because one of the things that continually was said throughout our interviews was people kept saying, when are we going to be done with DEI? Like the accountability, like there's an end date. And so part of, this idea of accountability is this is something that is part of a continuous improvement cycle. Accountability for this does not end at some point. I'm going to shift to one other question. We had a couple people asking about chancellors, presidents, deans, and other senior leaders and how they think about this, expanded form of accountability, or, kind of phrased differently, those who have adopted shared equity leadership, how do you think senior leaders brought their, maybe Raquel, their boards, got their boards, on board. So, and I know some of you weren't as deep in the data as I was for this particular project, but Raquel, you could speak to more generally some of the ways you've seen senior leaders get their boards around this. So just thoughts around, senior leaders kind of role in this. And I'll start with Raquel and then go to Sheri-Ann.
Yeah, and I'll tie it to another important piece of the report was just the idea of metrics, right? I think that's really important in changing our idea of what's data, what is good data. Both we need qualitative and quantitative. We need that experiential data. I think that has been something that I've seen that board and president relationship use really well, is like, well, what does this mean for me? Like, here are the numbers, but then there's this student voice that also comes in and they understand why this matters, right? And so you think about housing insecurity, food insecurity, all these different things that folks may see a percent but not understand what that means. What does it mean to be food insecure? It's like, oh, you can't eat every day, like that sort of thing. And so I think that is a really important piece with boards, is the data and how we get those data, how we can ask questions, right? Like the number one tool boards have is that inquiry, asking questions of the right people and getting that information back. And the president is really artful and skillful in bringing that information back to them in ways in which they can understand and how they can get that support. So I think that that's a really big piece, in talking about, I love what Cynthia was talking about in the last question, just about if we have it embedded in the strategic plan or in our policies, and we don't have to just worry about people and people getting tired, because people do get tired, people do have to deal with these structures, but that's really important. And so it does start with that board president relationship, is what are our policies, what are the practices that we have in place that then trickle down to, so we don't have to go against the grain, right? As people who are pushing for this, it's just something that we're required to do. So I think that that's a really important piece, is embedding it in the actual system at the institution.
Thanks, Raquel. And Sheri-Ann, any thoughts from your perspective about senior leaders and getting them on board?
So I do want to say ditto to Raquel, because one, I think the major things to get senior leaders on board is the data, right? And so they're still data driven, both, again, qualitative and quantitative. I'm still amazed that people were surprised when food insecurity became an issue for college students. I'm like, college students have always been food insecure. This is not new, but if you're not talking to the right people or looking at the data, you don't know that. And so the office that I think a lot of people don't pay enough attention is institutional research, right? So they have some of the hard numbers that we need, and you can do surveys on the non-standard metrics, and I think people should, frankly. And that works with senior leadership too. And I think, this is where the president and the board becomes also really important, by holding senior leaders responsible and accountable. They, to the question that you had asked, Cynthia, in terms of who the champions are, they're supposed to be the champions. And so there are times when, particularly when you think about power relationships, I was in a different role when we started our strategic plan, and I literally had staff and faculty whispering to me, can you bring this up in a meeting? And I'm like, are you kidding me right now? But they didn't feel, and they weren't wrong necessarily. We're talking about, at the time, some untenured faculty members and some junior staff members who said, could you bring this up as we were doing the strategic plan? And you need the champion who's willing to do that. And that's, in my mind, I see the role of senior leadership to do. And it's not always going to be comfortable for them. I also don't want to, because they've also, the thing that you talked about in the first report is the willingness of leaders having to do the hard work first, right? Before you can sort of talk, we can embed it in our strategic plan, but they need to understand what they're embedding and how they're having those conversations. And so are we all on the same page when we talk about DEI? But yeah, I think hopefully that answered your question.
Absolutely. And we are at time. So I want to thank our amazing panelists. It was such an honor to share this space with you and have this conversation. And I've seen lots of comments in the chat thanking you as well. And there is an evaluation that AC posted that they would love your feedback on the webinar. And otherwise, thanks everyone for being here, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.